because of the supply and demand dynamics, that this is really just the beginning, that actually investors are still early. Of course, this is not investment advice, and prices go up and down, and Bitcoin is a notoriously volatile asset. But the Bitwise price projection for 2025 is that Bitcoin price will break 200,000.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Bitwise Asset Management European Head Bradley Duke. Bradley, very good to speak with you this morning. And of course, in a week where we saw Bitcoin finally topping $100,000, only briefly yesterday, it's back below that today. But yeah, it was definitely a milestone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Good morning. It has been a very interesting period for Bitcoin and for crypto in general. And as you mentioned, there was a long-awaited 100K. Bitcoin reaching 100K happened yesterday, and there was a lot of excitement around that. I think what we've seen previously to that is a lot of people had set limit prices to sell Bitcoin or to take profit at the 100K mark or thereabouts. And so they, even though there was pressure to breach that amount, that level, there was a lot of selling pressure on the other side of it, with people wanting to, who've been on a long ride of Bitcoin and wanted to take some profit, and so there was some selling activity at the time. But so we've discussed before the seasonality of Bitcoin in particular, and how on average certain months of the year are better for others. And for example, the summer months are always a quiet period for Bitcoin in terms of its performance, its price performance. November has historically been the best month for Bitcoin, and this November wasn't any exception. In fact, it actually hits pretty much exactly the average of the previous 14 years of Bitcoin price performance this year, with an increase around 36% in the month alone, which is phenomenal. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons behind the price performance of Bitcoin and why it keeps pushing. Happy to talk about some of those.
Talk about perhaps the supply demand dynamics, because we've had that ETF buying this year, and particularly US ETFs buying Bitcoin. Is there scarcity of Bitcoin in the market?
No, 100%. There really is. So of course, Bitcoin is mostly, the price of Bitcoin is mostly governed by classic economic theory, supply and demand. What we've seen is both two things happening. On the one hand, on the demand side, we've seen that since the advent earlier this year of the Bitcoin ETFs in America, the approval by the SEC of the ETFs, early in 2024, we have seen huge amounts of inflows into these products, and in fact, they've been the most successful ETFs ever launched by a country mile. And what we've looked at is actually that the fact that the inflows into Bitcoin inflows into these ETFs has been over 414,000 Bitcoin, and this compares to the supply, in terms of mine supply that's coming, that the Bitcoin miners are in that same period, was 183,000. So it was more than double what the supply is. So of course you've got this demand that's there, and then the supply and this demand is outstripping the supply just on the US ETFs alone by more than double. And that's before you look at the European ETPs, corporations putting Bitcoin onto their balance sheets, and also just every other retail investor who's directly invested into Bitcoin. So it's phenomenal. And then on the supply side, we also see the liquidity, or the available liquidity of Bitcoin falling to its lowest levels ever, and the scarcity is just really it's through the floor. So if we look at the liquid supply of BTC versus the illiquid supply, we see that this measure is looking at what one of the things it's looking at is the Bitcoin that's available to trade. that's not in cold storage or not tied up, in an ETP, for example, an ETF. And that's so this is we're talking about coin that's on exchange, and people would put coin on exchange really if they want to sell. That's the only reason. When they want to hold, they're going to take it off exchange and put it into cold storage. And those levels have fallen to really a low level. So it's the lowest level certainly we track this, these levels, and it's really plummeting at the moment. So even though Bitcoin did go through 100K and then back down again, we feel that because of the supply and demand dynamics, that this is really just the beginning, that actually investors are still early. Of course, this is not investment advice, and prices go up and down, and Bitcoin is a notoriously volatile asset. But the Bitwise price projection for 2025 is that Bitcoin price will break 200,000, and we feel that that's relatively modest given the analysis that we've done.
While all the focus has been on Bitcoin, Bradley, looks like some of the altcoins have been moving higher stealthily in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, a lot of people who are interested in altcoins. And for people who don't know what altcoins are, they're all the other coins besides Bitcoin. And there's a lot of them. But really people focus on the highest market cap ones. And what we've seen, especially these past weeks, is that the altcoins have really even outperformed Bitcoin. And a good example is XRP. We've seen a 5x price growth really in the last 3 weeks. And there's a lot of challenger coins that have come to market, like Aptos, who's a challenger to Solana, who in turn is a challenger to Ethereum. These are all coins that are trying to do what Ethereum does, but better, greater throughput, cheaper, better suited for smart contract applications. So really, this is just a kind of like this sort of almost sort of Kaizen approach of incremental improvements to the blockchain tech, to make it better and better suited. Matt Hogan, the CIO of Bitwise, actually, I was speaking to him yesterday, and he said that, I said to him, "Is it alt season now?" Meaning altcoin season, and he said it's everything season. He said, on the one hand, usually what alt season means is that Bitcoin price is going down, but usually after a large rise, and then people are now investing in the smaller coins, chasing high yields. He said at the moment, Bitcoin's going up and the altcoins are going up. So it's kind of everything season in crypto for the time being.
And of course, it was very timely for your launch in November of the Aptos staking ETP, I suppose, Bradley.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So we we continue to bring products to market that we think investors want, and they want Delta One exposure to these cryptocurrencies through a wrapped and a regulated product trading on a regulated exchange, which solves a lot of problems for companies who want to invest and individual investors. And so the latest one we listed on 6 Swiss is Aptos APTB is the ticker. And that's we've seen nice inflows already into that product. In addition, we did a kind of a relaunch of the GXRP, which is the XRP ETP that we have, and that has been phenomenal performance. It's over 200 million in assets already. So there's really big growth there, and of course helps along by the phenomenal price performance in XRP, which is now the 3rd largest cryptocurrency after Bitcoin and Ethereum.
You've talked a lot about the tailwinds that are helping to propel Bitcoin, and of course those altcoins. How about some of the headwinds they face?
Yeah, so some of the headwinds that we see at the moment, of course, with the tailwinds, really the change in the Trump administration, which has been very clearly pro-crypto change in government, and also the exit of Gary Gensler, the anti-crypto SEC chair. There was announcements that Atkins was going to replace him, and that there was going to be a crypto czar being appointed. These are all, as you mentioned, tailwinds to help to propel. On the headwind side, we're seeing a strong dollar. This is also as a result of the election outcome, amongst other things. But we're seeing the dollar getting stronger and stronger, and of course, Bitcoin is quoted, primarily in US dollars, so it is a currency pair, and a strong dollar on the one side means that that is definitely a headwind in terms of the price of Bitcoin, and also if a currency is weakening, there's also more reason for people to want to invest and hedge assets like Bitcoin or gold. And so that very much is a headwind for the growth in the price of Bitcoin.
We'll have to wait and see whether we can get to that $200,000 mark next year, Bradley. As usual, thank you very much for all your insights.
Thank you so much.
That's Bradley Duke. He is European head of Bitwise Asset Management.